let me now invite our other keynote speaker, if everybody's finished poking at the keyboard here, Robert Cutler. Dr. Cutler is a senior researcher at the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at Carleton University. He's also a fellow at the Canadian International Council and at the Canadian Energy Research Institute, CIRI, which I believe is based in Calgary. Yeah. After over a dozen years of research and teaching of international relations at leading universities in Canada, France, Russia, Switzerland, and the United States, he expanded into policy analysis and consulting in international energy diplomacy. And that makes Robert eminently qualified to speak to us, which he will do for about 15 minutes. And then he will moderate the panel that will follow. And so I will allow, or leave it to Robert to introduce the other panelists when he's done his talk. Please come up to the podium, Robert.
First, I wish to thank the sponsors of this event for making it possible, and also the Macdonald-Laurier Institute for the invitation to participate. Initially, as was just said, I was asked to give this brief keynote address, and then I'm going to have to close this. Is that okay? And then, sometime later, I was asked whether I might also moderate the panel discussion, to which I agreed. So this keynote address also serves partly as an introduction not only to the panel, but also to the panelists. I divide these remarks into 4 parts. First, a general scene setting and discussion of Canada's resource wealth and the global context. Second, a look at the precarious energy supply of certain key allies in Europe, which has been the focus of much of my work. And then the Indo-Pacific, which is the region of primary concern to a majority of our panelists, and one that is of particular significance to the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Third, some comments about Canadian energy leadership and about the panel and the panelists and what I am given to understand that they might discuss. And fourth, by way of conclusion, a modest proposal for Canadian diplomacy because, well, why not? 1, Canada's energy resources. World energy consumption has more than tripled since 1965. In a world where population, life expectancy, average educational level, personal income per capita, and political participation are all increasing, the demand for energy will also only continue to grow. The world's energy mix is changing, but demand for oil will remain the principal energy source at least until 2040, while natural gas production will become the second largest energy source overall. Rising energy demand offers Canada an opportunity to serve global markets with responsibly produced energy, displacing production from countries with poorer environmental performance. Canada accounts for 5% of world natural gas production, 7% of world gas exports, 1% of world proved reserves, and 8% of world shale resources. All statistics are preliminary 2017 statistics. Canada accounts for 5% of world crude oil production, 7% of its exports, 20% of its proven crude oil reserves, of which 20%, 98% is oil sands, and 2% of world shale oil resources. In 2017, Canada was the largest foreign supplier of crude oil to the United States, representing 43% of total U.S. crude oil imports and 21% of U.S. refinery crude oil intake. However, because Canada is a series of regional refining markets rather than one national market, it imports some crude oil, 61% of which comes from the U.S., and most of the remainder from Saudi Arabia, Azerbaijan, Norway, and Nigeria. Canada exported 3.3 million barrels per day to the U.S. in 2017, 99% of all Canadian crude oil and equivalent exports. That is my statistical report. Now, you all know, of course, The reason why this is so, the dependence on the US market. Canada has no oil export pipelines that go to either coast for foreign markets, for other foreign markets. And this is so despite the fact that many Canadian friends and allies, such as Japan, would be very happy to see more Canadian energy going their way. Therefore, it is difficult to underestimate the significance of the LNG Canada agreement just announced for gas shipments to Japan, and which Mr. Aikida discussed. I may add that this is unequivocally a win-win deal for Japan and Canada, as world oil and gas consumption and production, driven by higher oil prices and anticipated increased gas demand, gas and oil production and consumption are set to spike significantly in 2020s. In contrast to the oil sands price outlook, which has stagnated due to a variety of market access issues, LNG prices are expected to improve, and LNG is increasingly a favored fuel. Canada is finally out of the starting blocks in the international race to garner oil and gas investments, even if these investments have already begun to boom elsewhere around the world. 2, the precarious energy security of key Indo-Pacific allies. The highly publicized natural gas cutoffs by Russia to Europe, violating agreed contracts in the winters of 2006 and 2009, are the most striking recent examples of threats to security of energy supply. The European Union has responded by increasing the number of gas pipeline interconnectors amongst its member states, particularly in the heavily affected Central and Eastern Europe, and by mandating the diversification and multiplication of supply sources, for example, the Southern Gas Corridor through Turkey, which will bring gas from the Caspian Sea directly into Europe. Other sources of gas supply disruptions, besides politically motivated and contractual disputes, include weather-related catastrophes such as hurricanes and typhoons, accidents such as fires and explosions. For the purposes of this panel, geopolitical and geoeconomic events are at issue. However, these may include, but are not limited to, the American sanctions against Iranian exports and the fragility of passage through the Straits of Malacca. Although the term Indo-Pacific was used a few times by American diplomats earlier this decade, its use did not accelerate in the American political discourse until after US President Donald Trump's 12-day visit to Asia in November 2017. Nevertheless, it had been percolating, the term Indo-Pacific, had been percolating through the Canadian political and diplomatic discourse for several years before that. A review of those writings reveals that many of the people discussing this question had been, in fact, or are associated or at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Whereas the Pacific Rim idea conjures the set of all states having a coast on the Pacific Ocean, whether in Asia or the Americas or elsewhere in the Asia-Pacific. The Asia-Pacific idea limits this to those states in Asia, although the so-called Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation in fact includes the whole Pacific Rim. So the term Indo-Pacific clearly extends the domain from Asia-Pacific into the Indian Ocean basin, and more or less clearly limits it to the Asian half of the Pacific Rim. This concept of Indo-Pacific puts greater emphasis on the role of India and its subcontinents, and makes Australia and other island nations nearby to the north more central than peripheral. The Indo-Pacific region in its broadest construal also includes Iran, the Arabian Peninsula, and every African country having an Indian Ocean coastline. Indeed, considering the Red Sea as an extension of the Indian Ocean, just as the Persian Gulf may be considered as such an extension, then Egypt, Israel, and Lebanon should also be considered part of the broadest construed Indo-Pacific region. In fact, we may consider that the central and southern Western Pacific become as like a door in between the Asian Pacific Rim and the Indo-Pacific region. To transform this simile to a metaphor, one might regard Australia as the threshold of the doorway, Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, and Indonesia as the hinge, and to extend the metaphor, the Straits of Malacca become the keyhole. 3, Canadian energy leadership. The aforementioned framework gives me the tool for briefly introducing the interventions soon to come by the speakers on the panel. Eleanor Sloan is a professor of international relations at Carleton University. She will focus on the Indo-Pacific and Pacific West scales of analysis, the broad maritime perspective of Canada's security and defense policy in the Pacific region, and the tactical and logistical issues about lines of communication and freedom of navigation in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. If time allows, I understand that she may possibly also discuss such Arctic issues as what Canada is doing to secure its own energy supplies and Canada's relations with Russia and so forth. James Boutillier will discuss, who is, Special Advisor for Policy at Canada's Maritime Forces Pacific Headquarters in Eskimo, British Columbia. Mr. Boutillier will discuss the Pacific West and Canadian national scales, focusing both on the security environment in the Pacific and on the issues involved in getting Canadian energy to Tidewater. Philip Cross is the former Chief Economic Analyst at Statistics Canada and an MLI Monk Senior Fellow. He will also bridge the Pacific West and Canadian national scales of analysis, addressing how Canadian energy development can contribute to the security of energy supply of Canada's partners, and also the economics of Canadian energy, including foreign direct investment in Canadian oil and gas. He will emphasize how Canada can derive not only strategic, but also economic benefit from developing oil and gas markets. And Hiroshi Kuwayama is General Manager at the Japan Oil, Gas, and Metals National Corporation, and he will discuss uncertainties in the investment environment in Canada with special attention to the First Nation issue, including the ambiguous scope of the duty to consult. He will also elaborate on Japan's growing interest in securing Canadian energy supplies. Now, about Canadian energy leadership. One might suppose that Canadian energy leadership would entail the production and world export of more Canadian oil and gas to Canadian allies in the Pacific, first of all Japan. Trans-Pacific shipments need not negotiate choke points or fragile and militarized transit regions like the South China Sea. Even more important is a culture of leadership in Canadian international diplomacy. But what would this mean today? One well-known approach to the history of Canadian grand strategy distinguishes three phases of development. An imperial model lasting through the early 1940s and entailing reliance on Britain at least as much as on the United States. A middle power punching above its weight model from the early 1940s through the early and mid-1980s. And a material model, since then, focusing on stability of trade while still coupled with an internationalist predisposition. The material model opens the way to a different kind of international leadership for Canada on the basis of past achievements and established reputation. One that bases the national interest, first of all, upon its material endowment, and for the benefit, first of all, of its own citizens. As the Swiss-American scholar of international affairs Arnold Wolfers put it in the middle of the last century, quote, "The psychology of the actors in the international arena, instead of operating in limitless space, is confined in its impact on policy by the limitations that external conditions place. External conditions such as the distribution of power, geographic location, demography, and economic conditions place on the choices open to governments in the conduct of foreign policy." What would it mean to take these realities explicitly into account in a material model of Canadian foreign policy. 4. Conclusion, a modest proposal. Canada is not part of the Indo-Pacific region, except insofar as the Pacific is extended to include the whole Pacific Rim, in which case it also includes the United States, Mexico, and those Central and South American countries having a Pacific coast. However, Canada has important geopolitical relations and common geoeconomic interests with significant countries in the Indo-Pacific region, in particular Japan and India, and not forgetting Australia. Although these are mere keynote remarks intended to introduce the panel, they are as good a place as any to float a modest proposal for Canadian diplomacy, which, after all, I promised you in the beginning. You all know that the so-called Quad, formerly the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or QSD, amongst Japan, Australia, India, and the United States, was informally revived by agreement amongst these countries' 4 leaders during the ASEAN summits in 2017. The QSD dates back to the 2007 initiative of Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, based upon the concept of a democratic peace to embrace most of Asia. It is worth noting, however, that the QSD had an antecedent in the trilateral security dialogue amongst Japan, Australia, and the United States, initiated in 2002. Canada has no reason to seek to duplicate the QSD and would fail if it tried to do so, since especially the QSD is nowadays contextualized, first of all, by the militarization of Chinese international behavior and by the threat that this brings against Asian security in general, as well as in particular instances that immediately come to mind. As it was put in an MLI commentary last August, co-authored by Mr. Crowley, Japan is a partner of Canada along with India for asserting the rule of law in the Indo-Pacific region, this as a response to China's rise. In fact, Canada could, without any cost or downside, explore its common interests within the 3 triangles: Japan, Canada, Australia, Japan, Canada, India, and Canada, Australia, India. Each of these 3 triangles would have a distinct configuration of relevant issue areas. For example, Canada's participation in a Japan-Canada-Australia triangle would be contextualized by the 2013 Japan-Australia Economic Partnership Agreement and by the 2 countries' moves in the direction of a common defense pact on the basis of their 2017 acquisition and cross-servicing agreement. Canada's participation in the Japan-Canada-India triangle would be contextualized by the 2014 Special Strategic and Global Partnership between Japan and India, and Canada's participation in a Canada-Australia-India triangle would be contextualized by the 3 countries' common heritage as Commonwealth countries. So, Canada should not expect a Canado-centric analog to the quadrilateral security dialogue to emerge from these 3 triangles together, but in the 21st century, of course, we know bilateral diplomacy can go only so far. And after all, multilateralism is part of the DNA of Canada's diplomacy. So it might be well worthwhile to explore such an initiative. Such an initiative should not be undertaken with any direct reference to the QSD or the tasks that the latter has set for itself. It should rather have for its agenda the pursuit of Canadian national interests defined first of all in the material sense in the context of the Canadian tradition of peace and security activities. Given the objective conditions as characterized by Arnold Wolfers, the objective conditions of Canada's international situation, cooperation on energy export outside North America is surely the most evident issue with which to start. Thank you very much.